Breaking news. A massive fracture ripped open along Mount Etna's flank, and scientists watching the data realized something had gone wrong. The mountain itself is beginning to break apart in real time. Mount Etna. Music. The confirmation came in a matter of seconds. Ground stress sensors that were installed along Etna's eastern flank were the first to jump beyond alarm thresholds, registering expansion rates several times higher than any episode logged in the past decade. At the same time, field cameras started to capture fresh surface cracks appearing downslope, lengthening by meters as they propagated toward lower elevations. GPS stations that normally drifted only millimeters per month snapped into abrupt motion with deformation forming and rotating eastward instead of upward. This directional change mattered more than the speed. It showed the mountain was no longer swelling but really pulling apart. Radar satellite scans soon followed and revealed zones of phase loss where the ground had moved too violently to track coherently. Scientists did not debate interpretation. Independent instruments designed to measure different physics were reporting the same failure from different angles. This was not a model projection or a probabilistic warning. It was a structural rupture measured in real time. Internal logs showed deformation rates exceeding Etna's long-term flank movement averages by more than fivefold within a single monitoring window. The fracture marked the precise moment Etna crossed from unstable to structurally compromised, forcing researchers to abandon slow creep assumptions instantly. The country raised the warning level on Mount Etna from green to yellow. Music, in light of the flank fracture, is not an acceleration of normal movement. For decades, Etna's eastern side has exhibited creep. Gradual sliding measured unnoticeable movements that are driven by gravity and magma pressure. What scientists observed here now was way different. Sensors recorded tensile failure where rock is pulled apart faster than it can elastically recover. Along the fracture, shear zones activated simultaneously, allowing large blocks to begin decoupling from the core of the volcano. This transition is important because creep absorbs stress over time while fracture releases it suddenly. Once rock strength is exceeded, motion no longer scales gradually. It jumps. Laboratory data on basaltic rock showed that once tensile strain rates exceed critical thresholds, failure can propagate exponentially along pre-weakened planes. That is why visible fractures alarm scientists more than inflation signals. They indicate the system has moved from deformation into breakdown. At that stage, magma intrusion is no longer the only driver. Gravity takes control. The flank does not need another eruption to move. It only needs momentum, and fractures provide exactly that pathway. What further intensified concern was not any single reading, but the convergence. High-precision GPS stations showed horizontal displacement rates exceeding previous Etna baselines by 6 to 8 times. That's not percent differences, but full multiples. Seen. So, I guess the Sicilians call her to Mother Mountain, Mother Etna, and she was getting angry. She's getting angry. Satellite imagery lost phase coherence across a widening corridor, which is a sign that surface motion exceeded several centimeters between satellite passes. Simultaneously, borehole strain meters recorded rapid volitric extension. At depth, indicating rock mass separation rather than surface slippage alone. Under normal unrest, these systems activate sequentially. This time, they aligned within the same monitoring cycle. Seismic data added another layer of low-frequency events clustered beneath the fracture. They were consistent with rock tearing rather than magma ascent. Scientists flagged this alignment as statistically rare. Archived data sets showed fewer than 3 comparable multi-instrument convergence events across Etna's entire modern monitoring history. Even then, none occurred during an active eruption phase. Deformation rates that usually unfold over years compressed into days. The instruments were not contradicting each other or offering competing interpretations. They were confirming the same failure state using entirely different physics. That coherence removed uncertainty and replaced it with urgency. The fracture did not open randomly. Subsurface models reveal it followed the geometry of buried detachment faults that predate modern eruptions by thousands of years. Beneath Etna's eastern flank lie clay-rich layers formed from altered volcanic ash and marine sediments, materials known to weaken dramatically under pressure. These layers act as natural slip planes, especially when lubricated by hydrothermal fluids. Seismic imaging ensures inherited fault scars from earlier flank collapses, some dating back over 100,000 years, quietly shaping stress distribution today. The new fracture aligned with these ancient structures rather than cutting across active vents, signaling tectonic reactivation rather than eruptive cracking. Because this fracture follows buried faults instead of vents, it is far more likely to stay open and keep spreading. Modeling suggests the current break intersects multiple weak horizons, creating a linked pathway from summit to sea-facing slopes. Past Etna collapses followed similar subsurface routes, not lava conduits. Scientists recognized the pattern immediately. The mountain was not simply responding to magma. It was reawakening a structural memory embedded deep within its foundation. So what are the folks there saying now? Is it safe to travel there? Yes, Savannah. So authorities in Sicily are saying the eruption itself has now ended, but they're closely monitoring the lava. It sounds logical to think an eruption would relieve pressure and calm the volcano. In reality, the opposite is likely to happen when magma moves sideways instead of straight up. When magma forces its way into cracks inside the mountain, think of it like a hydraulic jack. It does not gently leak pressure. It pushes rock apart. As molten material intrudes laterally, it wedges itself between solid layers, prying them wider with immense force. Even a few meters of intrusion can increase stress along a fracture by thousands of tons. Instead of sealing cracks, magma keeps them open and growing. Once inside, it cools slowly, hardening into rock that locks the fracture in a stretched position. That leaves the surrounding areas weaker than before. Measurements at Etna show magma migrating toward the fractured flank rather than retreating downward. This means the system is feeding the break when it should be starving it. Each new pulse adds pressure to rock that has been already damaged. Scientists worry because this process removes the mountain's ability to settle back into place. The fracture is no longer just a surface issue. It is being actively supported from within, turning a crack into a reinforced failure line that can keep expanding without warning. Rock does not heal the way skin does. Once it breaks at a large scale, its strength drops permanently. In Etna's case, the fracture formed through pulling forces strong enough to snap solid rock apart. That type of failure changes the internal structure forever. Microscopic bonds between grains are destroyed, making the rock easier to move the next time stress builds. Even if pressure decreases, friction along the broken surfaces stays low. Repeated movement polishes the rock, turning rough edges into smooth sliding planes. Studies from volcanic regions show that after just a few slip events, rock cohesion can drop by more than half. At that point, returning to the original strength is impossible. Gravity continues pulling the weakened flank downhill every day. Rainwater, heat, and volcanic gases seep into the crack, further reducing friction. Instead of closing, the fracture becomes a permanent weak spot. That is why scientists are not waiting for calm signals. Healing would require the mountain to rebuild strength it has already lost. Physics says that does not happen at the scale. Once failure begins, stability becomes the exception, not the rule. Scientists have seen this pattern before, and that history is what makes Etna's fracture so worrying. Before Anak Krakatau collapsed in 2018, long cracks opened along its flank, following old structural lines rather than lava paths. Those fractures widened quietly for months before the mountains suddenly gave way. A similar story played out at Mount St. Helens in 1980. There, a growing crack along the north side allowed the entire flank to bulge outward more than a meter per day. The collapse came not from a massive eruption, but from the failure of that weakened slope. In both cases, the warning sign was not explosive activity. It was structure. The fractures followed gravity-facing sides, cut across older layers, and showed sideways movement instead of vertical swelling. Etna's current fracture matches those traits closely. It is aligned with past collapsed zones, moving toward open space, not sealed vents. Researchers stress that collapse does not require the largest eruption imaginable. It only requires enough weakening for gravity to finish the job. History shows that once fractures reach this stage, the clock no longer runs on volcanic time. It runs on mechanical failure. A volcano is not a single solid block. It is built from layers stacked over time, each with different strengths. When one major fracture forms, it changes how stress is carried throughout the entire structure. The broken section can no longer support the weight it once did. That load shifts to nearby blocks, pushing them closer to their limits. Small cracks begin to form around the main fracture, even if they are not visible at the surface. This is known as cascading failure. One break makes the next more likely. Monitoring data at Etna shows subtle movement accelerating in areas that were previously stable, suggesting stress is spreading outward. This is how collapses grow. They rarely happen all at once. They build through a chain reaction of weakening zones. Each shift makes the mountain less balanced than before. Scientists worry because this process can speed up without obvious warning. Once enough internal supports fail, movement can jump from slow to sudden. At that stage, control is lost. The volcano does not decide what happens next. Physics does. And cascading failure is one of the hardest processes to stop once it begins. Music, scientists rarely use emotional language. Most reports are careful, measured, and conservative by design. That is why the tone shift around Etna has been so striking. Internal briefings began changing once the fracture was confirmed as active and growing. Instead of long-term probability ranges, models were rewritten to focus on short-term failure windows. Some simulations were abandoned entirely because small changes in input began producing wildly different outcomes. That loss of consistency is what alarms experts most. When outcomes diverge this sharply, no single plan remains reliable. Several monitoring teams flagged that their alert thresholds were being crossed simultaneously, something standard protocols are not built to handle. Emergency scenarios that were once labeled extreme were quietly moved into credible categories. Scientists also acknowledge that fracture propagation does not follow neat timelines. It can pause then accelerate suddenly without clear warning signals. That makes forecasting deeply uncertain. One researcher described the situation as watching a crack spread across glass, knowing it will fail, but not knowing when. The word terrified reflects that loss of control. Not panic, but the realization that the system is no longer behaving within known boundaries. When predictability disappears, even the best data stops offering comfort. Volcanoes are expected to erupt. They erupt, settle, and often return to familiar patterns. Structural failure is different. Once a mountain breaks internally, there is no reset button. From this point forward past eruption, behavior no longer sets the rules. Even if eruptions slow or stop, the weakness remains. The rock that fractured will never regain its original strength. Gravity will continue pulling on it day after day. That means future behavior will no longer follow historical cycles or eruption schedules. It will follow physics. Stress, weight, and friction now matter more than magma supply alone. Scientists stress that this does not mean collapse is guaranteed tomorrow. It means the system has crossed a threshold where outcomes are harder to limit. Each new intrusion, quake, or rainfall event interacts with a structure that is already compromised. Over time, options narrow. Etna is no longer just an active volcano releasing energy. It is a damaged structure carrying its own weight unevenly. That distinction changes everything. From monitoring strategy to emergency planning, the rules have shifted. What happens next will not be decided by past patterns, but by how much strain the mountain can still endure before it finally gives way. Let us know your thoughts in the comments.